Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 of my recording to releasing series. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the mixing and mastering process that I've used for the song that I've been working on, and I'm going to step you through the different changes that I've made in the mix and then going into the mastering process. The mixing and mastering process itself takes a few hours to do, so I've already mixed and mastered this, but I'm going to walk you through the different steps that I took in approaching this and then show you how I got from the beginning to the final part of the mix, so then I can go ahead and send it out to other people to listen to and send it out to distribution services as well. So I have the session opened up here. I'm just going to loop the third chorus because that has the most instrumentation going on, so we can really hear what is happening in the mix. If I go over to the mix window, you can see that I've got everything grouped by their category. So all of the drum tracks are in this drums group, all of the bass tracks are in this bass group, and then similarly with the guitars and the synthesizers. So what I like doing when I've grouped all these is take these down to usually about -6 to 9 decibels depending on the session, and what that allows me to do is hit the master output at a little less volume, so it gives me more headroom to work with things like a compressor or different saturators or things to that effect. So after I've got these turned down a little bit, I'm going to go in and get a good levels mix and then pan out the sources as need be. So I'm going to let you hear this so far with just the levels and panning. So now with the levels and panning sorted out, I'm going to go and do some broad moves on the master output that are going to affect the entirety of the mix. So on here, I generally like adding an EQ to scoop out some of the low-mid resonances and then add a little bit more top end. I'll also add in an SSL style compressor that's triggered by the snare drum primarily, doing about 2 to 4 decibels of gain reduction, and then usually run it through some kind of tape emulation program. So what this tape does is kind of give it a little bit more character, gives it a little bit of an EQ curve that's specific to this tape unit, and then softens up the transients a little bit. With this, I'm going to let you hear what the plugins that I have on the master bus are doing. And keep in mind that most of these are fairly delicate moves on the EQ because I'm affecting everything in the mix, so I don't want to do anything too drastic just yet. So hopefully you can hear that tightens it up a little bit and makes it sound a little more polished. So after I've done that on the master bus, then I'm going to go in and do a similar thing on all of these individual groups. So if I go through these groups one by one, I'm going to show you what I have on all of these and slowly turn them on. My drums, I like using an API channel strip because the EQ works pretty well from the sessions I've worked on in the past, just giving it a little bit of a lift in the top end and the bottom end and scooping out a little bit of the really low mids that makes things sound a little bit boxy. Then I'm using the API 2500 compressor. I like using this on drums because with the tone circuitry here, it gives it a very nice attack to it. And I'm cutting out an additional resonance on here as well. Moving over to the bass, I've just added some more EQ, SSL style channel strip, doing a few more EQ moves. Got a multi-band compressor on this, and basically what that's doing is allowing me to compress the low end here, containing a little bit more of the lows, and then some of the more kind of high mids where the pick attack is. I'm using an 1176. And a little bit more EQing here. And then I've got a compressor on here that's actually sidechained to the kick drum so that every time the kick drum hits, the bass ducks down a little bit just to let some of the transient poke through on the kick drum. With the guitar, I'm really only doing some EQing here because in this guitar group, I have some heavily distorted guitars and then I have a little more lightly overdriven guitar on here. So I don't really want to change their character a whole lot. I'm going to do that on the individual track. So with that, I'm doing a similar thing to the synthesizers. For these, I did most of the tone shaping in the sound design process when I was programming the MIDI for these. So really all I ended up doing for the synthesizers It's just rolling off some of the low end. So now I've gone back and turned on all of the plugin processing for the individual tracks themselves. I'm going to let you hear what that sounds like as I step through some of these tracks also. And what this does is just allow me to work individually on the separate tracks for making the moves that would be too broad to do on the group level. So then I just go in on the individual tracks and tighten them up that way. A lot of these I'm just using fairly basic EQ moves and some compression. Little things have different here and there. I'm using a snare trigger on this. With that, I've got it blended about 6 decibels below my actual snare. And what that does is just add a little bit more consistency, especially in the top end with the sample that I'm using from hit to hit. So I'll let you hear what that sounds like. I also had this Alex trigger, is one that is just a sample of the snare drum that I was using. So whenever I record a drum session, I like doing these one shots, which basically all this is just individual hits of the different drums. So if I need to, I can go in and replace some of these hits, or I can heavily shape them and use them for a different sample. So for that one, I didn't end up using it in the mix. I like the way that the sample that I was using from this snare trigger sounded. And then what I'm also going to do is go on and turn on all of the effects groups. So for these, really, I'm just adding a little bit of reverb. There's some snare reverb on here as well. I have a parallel compression bus that basically is being sent to individual elements that I want to run through a compressor and slam pretty hard. I don't think I'm actually using this in this mix though. Then I have some different delays for the guitars. So let me let you hear what this sounds like with all of the processing turned on. So with these, the only other things I can think of that would have been a little different is for the SansAmp plugin, or the SansAmp track that I used. I'm doing some different EQ shaping on this, and then various stages of compression through an 1176, and then this SSL style channel strip. The DI track I actually just ran through this SVT Pro plugin. And then other than that, just fairly basic mixing moves here and there. So now that I have the mix sitting where I want it to, I'm going to export this as just a stereo mix file and then start up on the mastering process. So I've imported the final mix into a new session that's dedicated to just the mastering. First off, that eliminates a lot of the processing for working on multiple tracks. So the system, my computer is really only working off of one track of audio. And second, I find that when I'm doing a mix and a master, if I do the mastering on the mix as well, I have a tendency to go back and adjust little things on the individual tracks. So thinking like, oh, I need to do this on the snare drum, or oh, maybe the bass needs to be a little louder here. Whereas this, I would have to go back to the mix session and re-export it and make the changes. So that's usually enough of a hassle to make me kind of commit to the mix that I've already been working on. So with this master, I'm going to loop the third chorus again. And I'm going to slowly turn on the plugins that I have in the mastering chain. The first one that I have on is this Neve. And this, I'm really only doing a little bit of a boost, probably 1.5 decibels at 60 hertz, and then cutting away maybe 1 decibel or so at 1.6 kilohertz. So I'm going to turn this on and off and let you hear it. So after that, I'm using the Manley Massive Passive. This is a parallel equalizer, meaning that for every decibel you're adding on here, it's still keeping in the original signal itself. So you're not really adding 6 decibels of 12K in there. You're adding that in parallel with the original signal. So it's not quite as noticeable, but it does help give it a little bit of a lift. Let me turn this on and off as well. And really what this is doing, I'm not doing anything on the low end because I like the response of the Neve a little better for that region. But I'm just adding a little bit at just over 1 kilohertz to add a bit more presence and attack to the mix, cutting out a little bit around 300 hertz, and then adding in a lot more upper range presence or air on the 12 kilohertz range. And you can hear what this really does is open it up a little bit more. So after that, I'm going in and using a multi-band compressor. And what this allows me to do is compress each frequency range independent of the others. And for this, I'm actually only doing this on the low end because there were multiple places where the bass guitar and the kick drum spiked out a little bit too much. So I just have these a little more contained on this without compressing any of the other frequency ranges. See, I'm compressing this a little harder than I normally would, but I'm also blending it in parallel, so I'm leaving a little bit of the original signal in there as well. Lastly, I'm adding in some more compression, so I'm using the SSL bus compressor again. The settings are a little different. Now I've got a slower attack time, quicker release, and a lighter ratio. So really this is just looking to smooth out the whole mix rather than clamp down on any specific transient. I'm not doing a whole lot of gain reduction on this either. And lastly, I'm adding a limiter on here. I'm just using the iZotope Ozone limiter on the modern setting. And with this, I typically shoot for around -9 RMS on here. I'll play this alongside of a reference track and get it pretty concurrent with those two. So it's usually right around there, but I'll let you hear what that does. It's really mostly what that's doing is cutting down on a few of the snare peaks on there and just bringing up the overall level of the track to make it a little more commercially competitive. So now I'm going to play this and just turn on and off the entire mastering chain so you can really hear what it does as a whole. What I'm also going to have to do is make it so that the volume is the same. So I'm actually going to turn off the limiter just so you can hear what that does, because your ears are going to be more receptive to the change in volume than the other changes in equalization and compression. So that's the master done, and now I'm just going to export this as well into a single stereo file that I can then go ahead and send out to people and to distribution services. So now that I have the mix and the master where I want it to be, I've exported it out into a single stereo audio file that I'm then going to use to upload to distribution services and to send to people. So the next video in the series is going to be showing you how to get the music that you have out to these different distribution services, as well as covering what you need to have when you submit those. Things like a band or an artist name, song title, album artwork, and just some different data that you need to have prepared on the back end so that when you upload it, it shows up correctly in all the different streaming services. So stay tuned for the next video. I'm going to be comparing CD Baby, TuneCore, and DistroKid because those are the 3 services I've used before in getting music out to streaming platforms. I'm just going to walk you through the process and give you some comparison points on the 3 services and how they differ as well as some of the other ones. So I hope to see you on the next video, and thanks again for watching.